Welcome, everyone. This is our usual lunchtime seminar series, part of our IMH lunchtime seminar series, and the last seminar for 2020. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Rosa Ritunnano. Rosa is a consultant psychiatrist in an early intervention service for psychosis in England. And she's also a PhD researcher here at the University of Birmingham at the Institute for Mental Health, funded through a Priestley Scholarship. It's a jointly funded scholarship between the University of Birmingham and Melbourne. So today's session, today's talk by Rosa, which is titled "Can Delusions Have and Give Meaning?" will last for approximately 30 minutes. And then we will allow some time for questions and a nice discussion in the end. You can post your questions. I'll be able to see the questions and feed them back to Rosa. So, Rosa, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to everyone that has connected today, especially if it's 8 o'clock in the morning where you are, and the effort is much appreciated. So let me share my screen. Okay, so you should be able to see my presentation now. Okay, Maria, can you just confirm?
Yes, we cannot. Absolutely fine, Rosa. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, so let me first start with some acknowledgements. I really want to say thank you to my patients, first of all, who have kindly agreed to share some of their experiences with us, and to my fantastic supervisors and collaborators, Lisa, Matthew, Clara, and Barnaby, who are also co-authors in some of the papers that I'll mention throughout the talk. So the aim of this talk is, but also the aim of my work in general, really, is to try and take a critical stance toward the implicit assumptions that shape our current understanding of psychopathological phenomena in psychiatry, and especially in the context of psychotic disorders such as delusions, and trying to look at these phenomena with fresh eyes, as much as this is possible to do. So the idea is to explore an alternative conceptual framework which makes room for meaning and purpose within what is often taken to be either meaningless in its strong interpretation or relatively unimportant in a more charitable interpretation. But besides this scholarly aim, really what I hope to achieve is that we start overcoming prejudices, that we tackle epistemic injustice, and that we move towards a more open and engaged interdisciplinary discussion. So just very briefly, this is the outline for the next about 28 minutes. So I'm afraid I will only really scratch the surface of the topic in the time we have, but do feel free to, send over your questions and get in touch afterwards if you wish to discuss further. So I will first present what I take to be the dominant paradigm in psychiatry, currently guiding approaches to investigating and treating delusions, and I call this the delusion-as-dysfunction paradigm. Then I argue that if we're interested in exploring the space of meaning and self-understanding, this paradigm doesn't really work. It's not a very good fit. And in this case, I think it is really indispensable that we turn to phenomenology and to narratives. And the reason for this, I hope, will become clearer just in a few minutes. Lastly, I will draw some initial conclusions. I'm still in the first year of my PhD, so there's a lot of work to do. But some possible conclusions on an alternative and compatible delusion as strategy paradigm. And just to clarify what I mean by dysfunction and strategy paradigms. So here I'm borrowing this distinction, or maybe it's best to say coexistence, from the work of philosopher and historian of science, Justin Garson. Justin identifies these two broader intellectual frameworks that seem to have historically governed the discipline of psychiatry, at least in America and Anglophone countries from the turn of the century until today. So on the dysfunction view, which is definitely more common since the 1970s and since the publication of DSM-3, when someone has a mental disorder, it is because something in that person's mind or brain cannot perform its function, its goal or job. So there's a sort of implicit assumption that there is a failure or a breakdown of some biological or psychological systems, and what psychiatrists are trying to do is mainly identify this failure and fix it. In contrast, but also coexisting, the madness as strategy paradigm, which I'm sure everyone agrees was definitely more common before the 1970s, particularly if you think of the psychoanalytic tradition, sees a list some mental disorders or symptoms as having a purpose or function for the individual. So we will shortly see how these two ways of understanding madness are also relevant for our discussion on delusions. But before we get into the conceptual nitty-gritty, let me tell you a story which puts my questions in a more practical context. So this is the story of Harry. I called it Harry the happiest man in the world, because this is how he describes himself. Harry was referred to early intervention services for a suspect first episode psychosis after telling his doctor that he had been the target of a worldwide conspiracy for the previous 5 years. Harry believes that people are being told lies since the day they're born, and that we all live in a sort of Truman Show, where the government and the NASA are using fake imagery to fool people into believing that what they see on TV is real. And Harry also believes that there is a hierarchy of people who are taunting him, and this hierarchy goes up to the Illuminati and the Queen. He thinks that there are lizard people in charge of the Earth that have made people believe that the Earth is round when in fact it is flat. Harry is also constantly followed by people in the streets who make signs such as scratching their nose or straightening their hair as an indication to him that they know about him and about his past deeds. They can interfere with his thoughts, but he's now able to communicate back, putting the right thoughts into people's mind. So one day, during one of my clinics, I said, Harry, this must be really, really distressing for you being followed and interfered with. What do you think would happen if you woke up one day and found out that all of this was not true, that people are not really following you? And this is what Harry said, which I've transcribed here verbatim. So I would ask you not to take a screenshot of this, please. So he said, if I went out one day and I realized that people weren't expecting me to be there, it would be a real shock again. I would be, I don't know, I got so used to people expecting me to be there and lash out with them. I would feel alone again, which is what everyone feels, like alone. So people are like a family for me. It's like a safety blanket. They make me feel so comfortable now. If I found out that they're not watching me and reading my mind, I would feel alone and crazy like everyone else. To feel like I have everyone following me around, whether it's negative or positive, that alone is a force of power. Knowing that you can influence people's mind in the right way, I feel like Jesus. Of course I'm not, but why not believe? So this is a very, I think, question-begging case, and it did raise a lot of questions for the clinical team looking after Harry. And some of these questions are relevant for us. For example, what is dysfunctional about Harry's delusions? And are Harry's delusions the source of the problem or a response to the problem? And what is Harry's life like with these these delusions, and what would it be like without them? And more importantly, do delusions have meaning for Harry, and are they giving meaning to his life? So I'll leave those questions just open for more discussions at the end. And I'll just start with just the dominant way of going about understanding what is happening here. So the traditional way to do this would be to, take your DSM-5 and try and look at what delusions are. And here I've copied, for example, the DSM-5 definition as a sort of proxy for what psychiatrists look for when they're in the business of diagnosing the delusionality of delusions, so what is pathological about them. And we can see the delusions are indexed as false beliefs, which are ill-grounded on incorrect inferences about reality, and which are firmly held despite counter-evidence and counter-argument. So besides many other issues with this definition that philosophers have already raised, it seems to me that this definition really reflects some implicit assumptions about the nature of delusions. In particular, that they are primarily cognitive, belief-based kind of dysfunctions, that the person has experiential access to a shared reality, but is drawing an incorrect conclusion from it, and that the person is maintaining these conclusions because of a failure of reasoning. So as a consequence, irrespective of where exactly the dysfunction lies, the proper locus of investigation is taken to be within higher order cognitive processes. And because the delusional content has no informational value about neither the world nor the self, some have gone as far as claiming that they are just empty speech acts devoid of any meaning. And this is the dominant view where in the clinical context, delusions are considered core transdiagnostic feature of psychotic disorders, obviously causing a lot of distress, depression, and harm. But I think there is a problem with this view. And here I argue that if we go with the strongest interpretation and take delusions to be inherently dysfunctional and devoid of meaning, it seems to me that we might be missing something fundamental, even essential and constitutive of what it is to be human. And this is the space of meaning. So what do I mean by meaning? So you see, defining meaning and meaningfulness is a very complex task in itself, and philosophers have been, discussing these issues for centuries. So we're probably not going to answer these questions in the next 20 minutes. But what I want to focus here is a naturalist and subjectivist perspective on meaning, which means that I'm concerned with the extent to which one's life is subjectively experienced as making sense and as being motivated and directed by valued goals. So, but is meaning just that? Because as I've just put it, it might seem like a trivial or incidental issues for psychiatrists, given that we really should be dealing with disease and illness and, curing people. So why are we even talking about this? And this is why I think this is very important, because meanings are constitutive of who we are, of our personhood. And I think that when we're sitting in our clinic, we're not sitting in front of a brain, or we're not sitting in front of a symptom floating around on its own, but we're sitting in front of a human person. And this might seem obvious for some, but I can tell you it's also very easily forgotten. The claim that human existence is expressive of and constituted by meanings shaped by self-interpretations is not only a thesis that runs across many different areas and disciplines in philosophy and psychology, but as Wakefield reminds us, meanings are also very real. and their function is part of our biological design. So there is nothing less medical about dealing with disordered meaning processing. So I'm not talking just about philosophy, but I'm talking about something that is also part of our biological systems, and I think the two things are very much compatible. So how do we go about then investigating meanings within the current framework? Because there's already a tension, as I've just showed. So here I'm probably a little bit prejudiced because of my phenomenological background, but my proposal is that we turn to phenomenological philosophy as applied to psychopathology, because this allows us to ground our investigation within human subjectivity, while avoiding the strong theoretical claims that other approaches might make. So phenomenology, as our own Matthew Broome and Giovanni Stangelini here have written in this lovely editorial from 2014, focuses on personal meanings in addition to causes, symptoms, and diagnosis. It's about bridging understanding, meaningfulness, and explanation, causality, and can operate in parallel with and integrate biomedical and neurocognitive approaches. So let me quickly give you some examples of how phenomenologists might, for example, understand delusions. And here I've just put together, sorry for the wall of text, put together a few excerpts from the contemporary phenomenological literature, where, for example, Louis Sens and Louis Pincus talk about delusions as involving a mutation of the ontological framework of experience itself. Radcliffe, for example, speaks of a different type of intentionality, different from that of mundane experiences of believing, remembering, imagining, or perceiving. Thomas Fuchs argues that delusions are not beliefs in the epistemic sense at all, as they lack the basis of a shared intentional relation to the world. Stangelini and Raballo talk about a fundamentally altered existential ontological structure of subjectivity, and Gallagher suggests that a better way of thinking about delusions is as a sort of parallel reality that one can enter just as one can enter into a dream reality or a fictional reality or a virtual reality. So I'm sure that non-phenomenologists in the audience will now probably be thinking, what does it all mean, this ontological framework? What does it mean? And I think the best way of explaining this is through reading first-person accounts or clinical descriptions from the phenomenological literature. And obviously the phenomenological literature is very, very rich. And here are just a couple of examples that I thought are very, very powerful on its own. For example, in Autobiography of a Schizophrenic Girl, Renée talks about objects around her as stage trappings, placed here and there, geometric cubes without meaning. She describes people looking weird, making movements without sense. You know, time and space might feel very different in a way that can't be described. And in Jasper's description of delusional mood, he says, you know, the atmosphere is all changed. It might just look unaltered in itself, but it still feels there's something wrong with it. It feels uncanny and distrustful. And even our sense of existing might be completely lost, as Parnasse, Joseph Parnasse describes really very eloquently in his work. So these are just some examples. So people might, for example, say, it is as if I'm not a part of this world. I have a strange ghostly feeling, as if I was from another planet. I'm also non-existent. Our innermost identity can disappear, or it can feel like we cease to exist. And obviously these are very distressing and perplexing experiences for the person. And one thing that we know little about and that has been investigated very little empirically is about how individuals understand, make sense of, and appropriate emerging disturbances of the self and world, like the ones we've just seen in the early stages of psychosis. So some of the questions that we might ask is, for example, how do individuals take a position, cope, or respond to these anomalous experiences? How do people understand, make sense of, and appropriate these experiences in the early stages of psychosis? What meaning resources do they turn to? And what role do meaning-making processes play in the shaping of these psychopathological phenomena? And I think here we might need another layer of understanding that takes into account the level of personhood, agency, and context. And this is the narrative level of understanding. And here by why am I talking about narrative? You might ask, isn't the phenomenological level sufficient to explain what is going on? I think we need narratives because human beings are fundamentally self-interpreting agents. And even if we don't have time to go into the philosophical literature, such as the work of Charles Taylor, Ricoeur, and McIntyre, I think the idea that our lives are in some sense story-like is quite intuitive, very appealing, and surely runs deep in our everyday thought. And as narrative psychologists have already proposed many years ago, you might be familiar with the work of Jerome Bruner or Theodore Sarbin, for example, stories seem to be the most natural way to recount and make sense of human experience. And for example, Jerome Bruner writes about a few features that are characteristic of narratives. One of them is its inherent sequentiality, where a narrative is composed of a unique sequence of events, mental states, and happenings involving human beings as a character or actors. But although these are the constituents of the narrative, actually what gives meaning to the whole thing is the overall configuration of the sequence as a whole, its plot or fabula. And a second feature of narrative is that it can be real or imaginary without loss of its power as a story. And this is really important for us. And the third crucial feature that he talks about is that narrative specializes in the forging of links between the exceptional and the ordinary. So narrative explications, he says, have the effect of framing the idiosyncratic in a lifelike fashion that can promote negotiation and avoid confrontation and disruption and strife. And I think this is really, really an important function of narratives, which other psychologists have also highlighted. For example, Sarbin in 1986 wrote, when a person confronts a novel occurrence for which no ready-made category or class is available, the occurrence remains uninstantiated, unclassified, or unassimilated until a class or category is located or invented. So I think the narrative, I think, is a fruitful metaphor for investigating and understanding delusions in psychiatry, in addition to the phenomenological level, because through sense-making processes, anomalous and novel experiences for which often the person doesn't have any ready-made category can be organized in a more familiar structure and shape. So the questions that all these things leave us with is really, could then the new delusional narrative restore a sense of meaningfulness and contribute to self-understanding? And I think if we go back to the story of Harry, like having gone through my proposal, I think we can then find space for meaning, and we can read what he's saying in a different light. For example, when he says it would be a real shock again not to have this understanding of reality, could it be that this new narrative is giving him a sense of coherence, restoring a sense of familiarity and a sense of belonging? And he says it's like a safety blanket, as if in some ways he knew that, maybe unconsciously or consciously, I don't know, but as if he knew that it's important for him, and it's having some sort of adaptive function. And also there seems to be a sort of sense of purpose, significance and fulfillment in this story. And another question that I'm looking at in my research is whether these delusional narratives could also have an identity constituting power. So there is still little evidence for this, and this is something that I will be working on in my PhD. But actually, there are a few empirical studies, for example, this one by Roberts, where he found that delusions can enhance a person's experience of meaning and purpose in life. Bergstein in 2008, they found that actually in some cases, delusions can contribute positively to a person's sense of coherence. And in a very recent paper on grandiose delusions, Isham et al. Found that they can provide a sense of purpose, belonging, and self-identity. And we're working on a systematic review at the moment to review the qualitative literature on this topic. So I think we are now getting towards the end. And here what I want to highlight as an initial conclusion is that maybe there is more to delusions than just the idea that the person is making an incorrect judgment about external reality because of a dysfunction. This is not to deny the pervasive harmfulness and distress at all. They're often associated, and the need for an explanation. However, I think it makes sense to understand delusions as meaningful because they have meaning for the person reporting them, a meaning that is grounded in the subjective experience. And they might also, maybe strategically, restore and give a sense of meaningfulness through a narrative reconstruction of their changing relationship with the lived world. So the clock is ticking. So I just want to say, everyone, thank you for attending. Do get in touch if you want to discuss further. I'm also giving another talk, longer talk tomorrow at FNO Lab, if you want to discuss more. And have a marvelous Christmas, and finally goodbye very soon to 2020.